I can still hear the pounding, the way his fists crashed against my body, the rage in his eyes, and the helplessness I felt as I floated above, watching my own lifeless body being battered. The smell of iron from my blood, mixed with his hot, alcohol-laced breath, will never leave me. They say that love can turn to hate, but no one ever warned me that love could also turn into something far darker, something unearthly. What I experienced in that house was not just a bad marriage, it was something cursed. A nightmare that still haunts me, even now. My name is Ifeoma, and this is how my marriage became the most terrifying chapter of my life. What you're about to hear is the story of how my life became a battleground between love and horror, between the man I thought I knew and the dark forces that sought to destroy me. I still remember the night when reality shattered, and I became a mere spectator of my own torment. It was the kind of night that sears itself into your memory, one that clings to your soul like a dark shadow you can never shake. I was sprawled on the floor, my body aching from the blows, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Emeka's fists, once the hands that cradled me in love, were now weapons of destruction, unleashing a storm of fury that felt otherworldly. My vision blurred, tears mixing with the blood on my face as his voice, guttural and foreign, filled the room. "Why don't you just listen, Ifeoma?" His words were a mixture of rage and something else I couldn't quite place, something darker, more sinister, that terrified me in ways I had never known. I floated above my battered body, hovering somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, and watched the scene as if I were no longer a part of it. His bloodshot eyes, wild with rage, didn't belong to the man I had married. Those were the eyes of someone, or something, possessed. The man who had once looked at me with tenderness and love was now unrecognizable. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, suffocated by fear. His hot, alcohol-laden breath filled the air, mingling with the stench of my own blood. The walls around me seemed to close in, transforming our once peaceful home into a prison, a suffocating nightmare where I was trapped with no way out. This wasn't the Emeka I had fallen in love with. It wasn't even the Emeka who had first shown signs of jealousy and anger. No, this was someone, something else. And it was in that moment, as I lay on the cold, hard floor, that I realized our story was far darker than I had ever imagined. I was living in the grip of something far more terrifying than domestic violence. There was a darkness here, a malevolent force that went beyond physical abuse. And as much as I wanted to escape, to wake up from this nightmare, I knew the shadows that had overtaken our lives weren't going to let me go that easily. When I first met Emeka, I thought I had found the man of my dreams. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a confidence that was magnetic. He worked in finance, and his easy smile and quick wit captivated me from the very start. It wasn't long before he swept me off my feet. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, one of those grand Nigerian affairs where the bride wears 3 different outfits and the food seems endless. I still remember the way he looked at me across the dance floor, his eyes locking onto mine, like I was the only person in the room. He approached me with a smile that made my heart skip a beat, and soon we were talking and laughing as if we had known each other our whole lives. My mother always told me that love should feel like a divine gift, like God himself had ordained it, and when I introduced Emeka to my family, I could see the approval in her eyes. My parents adored him. My father especially was taken with his charm and the way he spoke so respectfully, like he was someone who valued family and tradition. It didn't take long before we were planning our wedding. I was swept up in the whirlwind of preparations, the dress fittings, the venue hunting, the excitement of starting a new life with the man I loved. Our wedding day was perfect, or so it seemed at the time. The church was overflowing with people, and the reception was an explosion of color and music. We danced under the stars, surrounded by friends and family, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But happiness, I would later learn, can be an illusion. In the early days of our marriage, Emeka was everything I had hoped for in a husband. Our new duplex in Lagos was beautiful, filled with sunlight and the laughter of a couple in love. We spent hours talking about our future, about the children we would have, the life we would build. I remember the evenings when we would sit on the balcony, watching the sunset over the city, and I would rest my head on his shoulder, thinking this was the life I had always dreamed of. But even then, there were signs, little things, barely noticeable at first. His possessiveness, which I had once mistaken for deep affection, started to feel suffocating. If I spent too much time talking to other men, cousins, friends, even colleagues, his mood would darken. At first, he masked his jealousy with playful teasing, but soon, the playfulness gave way to anger. He would accuse me of flirting, of being too friendly with other men, and I would find myself apologizing for things I hadn't even done. In retrospect, I can see how blind I was, how much I had wanted to believe in the fairy tale. I told myself that every marriage had its challenges, that love was about compromise, about working through the rough patches. But what I didn't realize was that the cracks in our relationship were widening, and the darkness that had started to creep into our lives was only the beginning. The first 6 months of our marriage were in many ways the honeymoon phase. We were newlyweds, wrapped up in the excitement of building a life together. Our home was filled with new furniture, gifts from friends and family, and the scent of freshly painted walls. I spent my days making our house a home, cooking meals I knew he loved, keeping everything in order for when he returned from work. But as the months passed, the tension in our marriage grew more pronounced. Emeka's expectations became more rigid, his temper shorter. The smallest things would set him off: a forgotten task, a meal that wasn't to his liking, or even a casual conversation I had with a male colleague at church. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came one evening after work. I had spent the entire day preparing a meal for him, stewed and peppered pasta with chicken, his favorite. I had gone to the market early in the morning, hand-picking the best ingredients, wanting everything to be perfect for when he came home. When Emeka walked through the door, I greeted him with a smile and showed him the meal I had prepared. Instead of the appreciation I had expected, he looked at the food with disdain. "I told you I don't want this," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart sank. "But Emeka, this is your favorite. You always said you loved it." Without another word, he shoved the plate off the table, sending it crashing to the floor. The pasta splattered everywhere, the rich scent of spices filling the room. I stood there, stunned, unsure of what to do, as my hands began to tremble. "I'm sorry," I whispered, kneeling to clean up the mess, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. He didn't say a word. He simply walked away, leaving me to clean up the shattered remains of the meal I had so carefully prepared. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, the silence between us felt like a chasm. His back was turned to me, and I could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, but it felt like there was a wall between us. A coldness had seeped into our marriage, and no matter how hard I tried to reach him, Emeka was slipping further and further away. The first time Emeka hit me was like a scene from a nightmare, only this nightmare wasn't one I could wake up from. It was a Friday evening. I remember it clearly because I had spent the day cleaning the house and making sure everything was perfect for his return. But when Emeka came home, something was different. His steps were heavy, his movements slow and unsteady. The stench of alcohol hit me before I even saw him, and when he walked into the room, I could tell he had been drinking. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Where have you been, Emeka?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked past me, his eyes glassy, his face set in a hard line. I followed him, my heart beating faster. "Emeka, talk to me. You've been drinking. Where were you?" Suddenly, he turned on me, his face twisted with anger. Before I could react, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. The force of it was enough to send me stumbling back against the wall. I gasped, my body jolting from the impact. "What do you mean? Where have I been?" he shouted, his voice booming through the room. "Emeka, please," I started, but the words barely left my lips before his hand came down hard across my face. The slap was so forceful that I felt the sting instantly, a sharp, burning sensation spreading across my cheek. My vision blurred, and I stumbled, trying to regain my balance. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. I looked up at him, my hand pressed against my throbbing cheek, and saw the wildness in his eyes. There was no remorse, no regret, just pure, unadulterated rage. This was the moment everything changed, the moment the man I had married became a stranger. In the days that followed, Emeka's anger continued to escalate. The violence became more frequent, more brutal, and each time I was left wondering how I had gotten to this point. How had I fallen so deeply in love with a man who now seemed intent on destroying me? But then something strange happened. One evening, after another brutal encounter, I found myself alone in our bedroom, nursing a bruise on my arm. I had been cleaning up the aftermath of one of Emeka's outbursts when I noticed something strange: a small, folded piece of paper hidden beneath a stack of old letters in his drawer. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding, before I picked it up. It was an old letter, worn and yellowed with age. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and as I began to read, a chill ran down my spine. The letter was from an elder in Emeka's village, written to his father many years ago. It spoke of a curse, a dark cloud that had hung over Emeka's family for generations. The letter warned of a spirit that possessed the men of his bloodline, a spirit that would drive them to violence and madness unless it was properly appeased. I read the letter again and again, my hands trembling. Could this be the reason behind Emeka's transformation? Could it be that he wasn't entirely responsible for his actions? That something darker, something more sinister, had taken hold of him? I wasn't sure what to believe. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening to Emeka was far more than just anger or jealousy. There was something evil at play, something that had taken root in his soul, feeding on his rage and turning him into a monster. And as much as I wanted to escape, to run as far away as I could, I knew that this was no ordinary fight. This was a battle for Emeka's soul, a battle against forces I couldn't even begin to understand. The revelation of the curse weighed heavily on my mind. I knew I couldn't face this alone, but who could I turn to? My parents had been so proud of my marriage to Emeka, so convinced that he was the perfect man. How could I tell them that the man they adored had become my worst nightmare? But I needed help. I needed someone who could tell me if this curse was real, if there was any way to break it, or if I was doomed to live in this nightmare forever. I sought out a local elder, a man known for his deep knowledge of traditional beliefs and spiritual matters. His name was Elder Badmus, and he lived in a small, secluded house on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, he greeted me with a knowing look, as if he could sense the turmoil I was carrying. I told him everything about Emeka's transformation, about the letter I had found, about the violence that was tearing apart our marriage. Elder Badmus listened in silence, his weathered face expressionless. When I finished, he nodded slowly and gestured for me to sit. "You are not wrong to fear what you have uncovered," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The curse on Emeka's family is very real, and it is ancient. It has been passed down from father to son, from generation to generation, and unless it is broken, it will continue to destroy the men of his bloodline." "But how do I break it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me with sad eyes. "Breaking a curse like this is not easy. It requires great strength and sacrifice. The spirit that possesses Emeka is powerful, and it will not release him willingly." Tears filled my eyes as I thought of the man I had loved, the man who had once been kind and gentle. Could I save him? Could I free him from this darkness? "I will do whatever it takes," I said, my voice filled with determination. "Tell me what I need to do." Elder Badmus explained the ritual to me in great detail. It was a complex and dangerous process, one that involved confronting the spirit that had taken hold of Emeka and driving it out once and for all. But there was a catch. If the ritual failed, the spirit would not only destroy Emeka, but it could also come for me. Still, I knew I had no choice. If I didn't try, I would lose Emeka forever, and I couldn't live with that. Despite everything, I still loved him. I loved the man he had once been, and I believed that somewhere deep inside that man still existed. The night of the ritual, I prepared everything as Elder Badmus instructed, and the ritual was heavy with tension. The air seemed thick with anticipation, as if the very walls of our home knew what was about to take place. Emeka was asleep in the bedroom, oblivious to what was coming. I had waited until he had passed out from another night of drinking before I began setting things up. Elder Badmus had given me strict instructions. The items required for the ritual were simple but potent: salt, cowrie shells, a bowl of water, and a small wooden figure carved in the likeness of an ancient spirit meant to represent Emeka's soul. The most important part, however, was the circular drawing of a star, a significant drawing made of chalk that I had to create on the floor of the bedroom where Emeka slept. This star would act as a spiritual prison, containing the dark spirit during the confrontation. My hands shook as I knelt on the floor, drawing the intricate star pattern Elder Badmus had shown me. I could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of Emeka's breathing behind me, and I wondered if this would be the last time I would hear him sleep so peacefully. The thought made my heart ache, but I pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt tonight. Once the star was complete, I placed the bowl of water at its center and carefully arranged the cowrie shells around the edge. The final step was placing the small wooden figure in the bowl, submerging it in the water. Elder Badmus's words echoed in my mind. You must confront the spirit directly. It will resist, but you cannot waver. This is not a battle of strength, but of will. With everything in place, I took a deep breath and began the chant Elder Badmus had taught me. The words felt strange on my tongue, ancient and foreign, but I spoke them with conviction. The room seemed to pulse with energy as I repeated the chant, louder and more forceful each time. Suddenly, Emeka stirred in his sleep. His body twitched, and he let out a low guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. His breathing became labored, just as if something heavy was pressing down on him. I kept chanting, my voice shaking but steady, knowing that I was reaching the spirit now. Emeka's eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment I saw the man I had once loved, confused, vulnerable, searching for something. But then his expression twisted into one of pure rage. His eyes, once brown and familiar, darkened to an inky black, and a low growl escaped his throat. The spirit had awoken. He sat up with unnatural speed, his body moving in ways that seemed inhuman. His voice when he spoke was not his own. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. You think you can banish me? The voice hissed. I have been with him since the beginning. You are nothing, girl. You cannot save him. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep chanting. I couldn't let the spirit see my fear. I had to be strong, for Emeka, for myself. Emeka, or rather the thing that controlled him, rose from the bed and stepped toward me, but the star held him back. His body shuddered violently as he tried to cross the chalk lines, but they glowed faintly, acting as a barrier between us. Release him, I commanded, my voice trembling but determined. You have no place here. The spirit laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. You are a fool. He belongs to me. His soul is mine. I didn't respond. I just stood there, not knowing what else to do. I thought driving out whatever it was that bound Emeka would be as simple as reciting a few incantations. But that was far from the truth. Nothing seemed to be working. But I recited more incantations and chanted more, commanding the dark entity to leave Emeka. No, it roared, its voice shaking the walls of the room. You cannot take him from me. But I didn't stop. I continued chanting, calling on the forces that Elder Badmus had invoked to banish the spirit. The air around me seemed to thrum with power, and for the first time, I felt the spirit's grip on Emeka begin to weaken. Emeka's body convulsed, his face twisted in pain as the spirit fought to maintain control. His eyes flickered between the dark, soulless black and the familiar brown I knew so well. I could see him, the real him, trying to break free, trying to fight his way back to me. Ifeoma, he gasped, his voice weak and strained. Help me. Tears filled my eyes as I continued the chant, louder now, more forceful. I could feel the power of the ritual building, pushing the spirit back, forcing it to release its hold on him. But the spirit wasn't giving up without a fight. With a final, desperate scream, Emeka lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, nearly breaking my ankle, but the star flared to life once more, holding him in place. His body shook violently, and for a moment, I thought the spirit would break free. But then, with a deafening roar, the spirit was expelled from him. Emeka collapsed to the floor, unconscious, his body limp and motionless. The room was eerily silent, the only sound the soft hum of the wind outside. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as I checked for his pulse. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was pale and clammy. I had succeeded in banishing the spirit, but at what cost? The days following the ritual were a blur of uncertainty and fear. Emeka remained unconscious for 2 full days, his body weak from the struggle. I stayed by his side, watching over him, praying that when he woke up, the man I loved would return to me. On the third day, he stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and I held my breath, waiting for him to wake. When his eyes finally opened, they were brown, the warm, familiar brown that I had fallen in love with. Ifeoma? His voice was weak, but it was him, the real Emeka. Tears filled my eyes as I took his hand. "I'm here," I whispered, relief flooding my chest. He blinked, his face clouded with confusion. "What happened? I don't remember." I squeezed his hand, unsure of how to explain everything that had transpired. How could I tell him about the spirit that had possessed him, about the curse that had driven him to violence? "You've been sick," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "But you're going to be okay now. Everything is going to be okay." For a moment, Emeka seemed to accept my words, but as the days passed, I noticed a change in him. He was quieter, more withdrawn. He seemed haunted by something, though he couldn't remember the details of what had happened during the time the spirit had controlled him. The violence had stopped, but the emotional distance between us remained. It was as if the spirit had left a scar on his soul, a wound that couldn't be healed so easily. As the weeks went by, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I took care of Emeka, nursed him back to health, and tried to put the events of the past behind us. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the curse had left a permanent mark on our lives. One night, as we sat together in the living room, Emeka turned to me, his expression serious. "Ifeoma," he said quietly, "there's something wrong. I don't feel right. It's like a part of me is missing." My heart sank. I had feared this. Elder Badmus had warned me that even if the spirit was banished, there would be consequences. Emeka had been freed from the possession, but the damage had been done. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll figure it out," I promised. "We'll find a way to heal." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if it was possible. The curse had been broken, but the darkness it had left behind lingered like a shadow over our lives. And so, we continued, living in the aftermath of the horror we had faced, trying to rebuild our lives one piece at a time. The man I had loved had returned to me, but he wasn't the same. Neither of us were. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a fragile normalcy. Emeka had regained his strength, but something in him had changed permanently. His once lively, confident demeanor had been replaced with a quiet introspection, as though a part of him had been left behind in the spirit's grip. He often had nightmares, waking in the dead of night covered in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. One evening, as we sat together in the fading light of the sunset, Emeka broke the silence that had settled between us. "Ifeoma," he began, his voice low, "I don't think I can stay here." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temples as though trying to ease a persistent pain. "I've been thinking about everything, about the curse, about what happened. I don't feel like I belong in this life anymore. It's like I'm carrying something dark inside me, something I can't shake." I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had known, deep down, that something like this was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. "You don't have to go through this alone," I said softly, my voice trembling. "We can get through this together." But Emeka shook his head, his expression filled with sorrow. "I don't want to hurt you anymore, Ifeoma. You've been through enough because of me. I need to find a way to heal, on my own." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I knew there was no point in arguing. Emeka had made up his mind, and in truth, I couldn't blame him. The curse had taken its toll on both of us, and though the violence had ended, the scars it had left behind were deep. "I'll always love you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "But I need to figure out who I am now, without the darkness." "Where will you go? What will you do?" I asked, worried and confused, with 1,000 more questions racing through my mind at once. He looked at me with a smile and said with a determined look in his eyes that I was too familiar with when his mind is made up about something. "Maybe a church retreat ground or something. I will figure it out. I just need this break to really figure things out." He drew me close, with tears flowing down his cheeks, and wrapped me up in his warm embrace. "Please, don't leave," I whispered in his ears. "I have to," he said calmly, stroking and brushing my hair with his fingers. And so, with a heavy heart, I watched as the man I had loved, the man I had fought so hard to save, walked away from me, leaving behind the life we had built together. But at that moment in time, I surprisingly found myself not willing to fight or resist his departure any further. Don't get me wrong. A part of me wanted him to stay, another part really wanted him to leave. It's as if I really wanted him out of my life. Yes, I loved him, but I too need a break. The truth is, somehow I still have this weak, but almost certain feeling that Emeka wasn't entirely free from the darkness that surrounded him. Merely looking at him, you could still feel the dark aura floating around him, waiting to invade his life, and by extension, my life and family again. It's a mixture of doubts and fear of a future likely reoccurrence of the dark episodes in his life, our marriage and family, and I wouldn't want to go through that again. That night, I ran to my parents' house, sobbing uncontrollably. I told them everything, the beatings, the hauntings, the curse. They didn't believe me at first, but when they saw the bruises on my body and the terror in my eyes, they knew something was wrong. I thought I was safe once I left Emeka, but I was wrong. The nightmares continued. The voices still called to me, and sometimes, late at night, I could feel that same cold hand wrapping around my ankle, pulling me back into the darkness. I later learned that Emeka had died in his sleep, alone in a hotel room. Some say it was a heart attack, but I know better. I knew Emeka wasn't totally free. The curse claimed him, just like it tried to claim me. Now, I live with my parents, trying to move on from the horrors of my past. But even now, I can still feel it. The presence, watching, waiting. I know it's not over. It will never be over. In the months that followed, I learned to live without Emeka. The life felt emptier without him, but in time, I found a sense of peace. I sought out Elder Badmus again, telling him about all that happened to me and Emeka. I also asked him for guidance on how to heal, not just from the curse, but from the pain it had caused. He told me that healing would come with time, but that I had already proven my strength by confronting the darkness that had threatened to consume my life. "You are stronger than you realize," he said with a gentle smile, "and that strength will carry you forward, no matter what." And so I began to rebuild, slowly, piece by piece. I found solace in my work, in the support of my friends and family, and in the knowledge that I had done everything I could to save the man I had loved. The curse may still linger, but it won't have me, just as it had Emeka. I was no longer the naive girl who had believed in fairy tale endings. I had faced the darkness and survived, and in doing so I had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew I had. And though the future was uncertain, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it, with courage, with resilience, and with the knowledge that I had the power to overcome even the darkest of curses. This is my story, the story of a cursed marriage and the horror I will never escape. Follow this page or subscribe to this channel for more stories.